Hi, I'm talking about this because I organised a conference about this time last year in Lancaster, and I live in Lancaster, about dealing with extreme weather. And just to start off by saying that when people talk about climate change, global warming, people think about it getting warmer. And there's been a lot of talk about, well, warmer weather also means there's more energy in the system, there's more intense rainfall, there's stronger winds. But it's not just that we need to think about, because there's also, as we've been seeing, the changing weather patterns. So basically, so this is one example of that, what's happening to the jet stream. The jet stream is a series of high altitude winds which form the barrier between the warmer weather to the south and the cold weather in the Arctic. And as the Arctic is warming faster than the equator, the temperature differential that drives these winds is breaking down. So you've got the jet stream meandering all over the place. I've nicked this from The Guardian, it says at the bottom. I think it just explains it quite well. And so, you can get the jet stream stuck over a particular location for sort of months at a time, giving you loads and loads of weather, loads of rain. So that's what happened in the northwest in the November, December 2015. And then it happened in Spain, I think, in 2016. But you can also get warm air moving north, cold air moving south. So you get snow in Greece while it's unnaturally warm in the Arctic, and the meanders sort of block the sort of normal way that weather patterns move across. So weather seems to be, we're getting into a situation where the weather gets stuck for longer periods. So the heat wave we had this summer was because there was a sort of high that just got stuck over Western Europe. So we've got different patterns of weather, and in the longer term, we might have much more dramatic changes on the way for Western Europe if the Gulf Stream, which is the red lines here, going up to the where the Gulf Stream with the red line, if that breaks down and it is weakening, we're currently much warmer than similar latitudes in the States. Well, we're milder. We're warmer in the winter and not so hot in the summer. And if you think that March through to July, that's sort of perhaps more continental weather, really cold and then really hot. So are we going to face more stuff like that? So we've got different weather patterns. Perhaps it's going to keep changing. So how are we going to learn to cope with all these changes, these bigger extremes of weather happening more often? And I'm going to talk about two examples from Western Europe where we've sort of got more first-hand accounts that aren't so dramatic as the sort of hurricanes that you got in the States last year, but we've got more, perhaps they're sort of closer to hand in a way, from the conference that I organised last year. So I've shamelessly nicked some slides from that conference. So this is from a guy called Roger Kemp who taught there. And because we had several talks about Storm Desmond that hit Lancaster on the 5th of December 2015, and this sort of shows the rainfall pattern that you've got there. And we actually it came at the end of a month's worth of rain, which is quite a lot even for us. I think there was only one day in November that didn't rain in the whole of November and December that year. So it was a day of heavy rain, very heavy rain after a month. And so this just shows where Lancaster is. You've got the River Lune, it flows down from the Howgills, which are sort of the hills on the east side of the Lake District, down into Lancaster. And so on that day, those fells were all really saturated and the water just came right down the river. So this is sort of, so this is the Saturday 15th, so sort of early evening, I think, so you can see the water's rising. But all that day there'd been normal life going on in the city centre, we're hardy over there, we go out whatever the weather, people out shopping, having weddings and all that sort of stuff. And there was a red alert for the northern reaches of the Lune, but only an amber alert for Lancaster near the river on Saturday. But the river rose as the day went on. You can see that's next to the quay, it's coming up. That's the cycle path there with the railings, that's all underwater. And then the wall, on the flood wall. And actually, interestingly, they sort of made great efforts to close the gate of the flood wall, but the water came round the back because the trouble was there was so much surface water coming off from the town, it couldn't really get into the river. So this shows you roughly what Lancaster's like. There's a map of Lancaster. If I put that, can you see that? No, you can't. So this is the town centre, one-way system. This is high ground. That's high ground. So basically, there's a valley in the middle, the river there, and these are all the bits that flooded. So it's not a big area. It's not like Carlisle where you've got loads and loads of housing on flat land, because most of it is quite high up. And the bits next to the river, they're all industrial bits. But up there, where the arrow is, just to the left of that, this is a thing here. And importantly, that is the electricity substation. And that flooded. So at 10:30 at night, all the lights went out. No electricity over the whole of the urban area. So that's the electricity substation. It's there because that was the power station. So it's next to, there was a railway line there that came over from Yorkshire, it's now closed, that brought in the coal, water for cooling, excellent location. The last major flood was in 1907, so nobody thought about, and it was built, the power station was built in 1915, nobody's since thought it might be a good idea to move it. So that's the whole of the power supply for most of the urban area in Lancaster that went out. And this is afterwards. So just on the night, the river was coming up. Police were having to stop people, you know, drunken people, this is Saturday night, going down and sort of revelling, getting wet, jumping into the waters. They laid all the bridges were closed. There's 3 bridges, 2 road bridges and a footbridge over the river. There's a footbridge there. That's a railway bridge it's got a pedestrian walkway along, but it's very high up, so that was okay. But the other bridges, there's some containers that came down from higher up, floated down from higher up the river and smashed into these bridges. So the police closed the bridges. They weren't actually flooded, but they closed them and stopped anybody getting across. So it meant that to get home to Morecambe, if you were out of Lancaster, you had at least a 20-mile round trip to get home. And so they did lay on some buses from further up, and people, you know, pubs let people sit there in the dark with blankets and gave them food and this sort of stuff. So that's, I've just got a few slides now of the actual flood. So that shows it must have been early in the morning on the Sunday. You can see the water. This is the bus station. This is the bus station here. And then the next slide is looking down that street. That's that street. And this is just up the Lune Valley. You can see it's not normally like that. That's a big floodplain. So I live up on the hill to the east side of Lancaster. The lights had gone out, but you know, we got up. We didn't really, effectively we just went to bed at 10:30. The lights went out. Got up. There's no electricity. Oh dear, there's a power cut. But we had no idea what had happened. I think this is what you don't realise, that people in the situation don't know what's going on. So we got up and me and my son went to the local Quaker meeting, which was what we normally do on a Sunday morning. You go across town and you realise that nowhere else has got electricity either. We met somebody we knew trying to buy matches because they didn't have any matches. And so we went to the meeting and we sat there and there was no heating, of course. But it was nice and sunny. It was a nice sunny day. So we sat there just for half an hour because it was rather cold. And then we went down to the river, and this is a picture of you can just about see there's a sort of higher up wall, there were loads of people out, it was great, you know, lots of people came down, to see the river, which it doesn't really quite portray it, but it was a raging torrent. You know, this is much higher than it normally is, and somebody said this is low tide. We are in an estuary. So, yeah, so that's how it was. But just, and that is also where I learned that the police person standing there, on one of the other bridges, was where I learned that what had happened, that the power, that the substation was out. It might be out until Tuesday. That's what we were told. That's how we found out what was going on, by going out and asking. So I think everybody in Lancaster now realises what happens when you don't have electricity. So you have all this that you're so used to that is suddenly not there anymore. And, you know, like for us, it wasn't too bad. You know, the main thing was no communication, because unfortunately we didn't have a plug-in phone. Plug-in phones still work, but the sort with the bit that you carry around the house. So I've now got one that I keep in the cupboard. Because that is the only way that you can communicate. And but fortunately we did have a wood-burning stove and a gas hob, so we were warm, we could cook. If you lived in a flat, you were really stuffed. Because there's, you know, no lifts, no cooking, everything's dependent on electricity, perhaps even the water, you know, if you've got pump water. I met some people afterwards who'd been to visit an elderly person they knew who lived near the bus station in a flat. They'd walked there on the Sunday over the bridge, over the because they lived north of the river, walked over the railway bridge, and they'd gone to her flat and hadn't been able to get in because it's you know, one of these systems where you have to press a buzzer. That didn't work. There's no way they could get in to check how she was. So, you know, doors are a real critical thing actually, with electronic control of so many doors, that you need to think about what happens if there's a power cut and there's no power for a day or so, or, you know, for however long. But the doors need to be able to lock with a key, open with a key, and, you know, have a manual override. I think that's my lesson. Very important. So, and then also we've got to care in the community, where a lot of how people are cared for in their homes is dependent a lot on electricity. Also to communicate with carers and people like that. So I had a friend whose husband is reliant on oxygen, who ended up having to carry him down the stairs, you know, or getting some other people to carry him down the stairs, put him in a car and take him to a hotel for a few days because they couldn't, you know, decided it wasn't safe to stay there. I think they had some emergency thing that lasted a few hours, but after that they were dependent on electricity. So people sort of muddled through. This is again from Roger Kemp, who I'll tell you who he was in a bit. So this is what the care home did. Somebody, you know, the chef had a barbecue in the garden. Fortunately it was dry and sunny on the Sunday. People brought in a camper van, you know, people sort of made do. But, you know, that's what you have to do, I suppose. And there were stories about people inviting neighbours in to, you know, cook for them because the neighbours didn't have any cooking facilities. But I've also got a friend who said their neighbours watched them cooking in a barbecue in the rain. I think that must be the next day in the garden because they didn't have any other cooking facilities. So what actually happened was that they brought in, we've lost a bit there. I think it's about 75 generators from all over the country, so every little street, you know, there was a substation round the corner from our house. It had this generator outside for a few days, giving us power. Now, you could do that for Lancaster, but what if it happened to Birmingham? Or what if it happened to sort of, you know, Lancaster, Kendal, you know, sort of Preston, all of them at once? You know, that's the sort of, it's not quite so straightforward. So it was back on, so the electricity was back on Monday, but then it went off on these generators. So it went off again on Monday evening for a bit. And then my son was off school for 3 days because the schools just closed because they were told that they couldn't rely on the electricity supply. So in March, Roger Kemp, whose slides I've been nicking, he organised this workshop. he's in the engineering department at the university, and they brought together lots of people from the town to share their experience of the power cut. I think it was a really valuable thing to do, and he produced this report, Living Without Electricity, which is available on the internet. And I think one of the things that brought out was the diffusion of responsibility for critical systems between different organisations, so who ends up being in control, and also geographically. So it means that the people on the ground aren't able to make decisions because the person who's in charge is somewhere else, and they can't communicate with them because they've got their phone and no internet. Yes. So the manager of Lancaster Railway Station is based in Carlisle. You know, those sorts of things. The alarm for a local primary school was monitored in Belfast. You know, so it's all these things you discover when this sort of things happen. And people like head teachers, the vice chancellor of the university, they felt they were really on their own, and nobody really told them what to do, you know, gave them any advice, or, you know, didn't know how to respond. You know, like the vice chancellor at the university apparently was phoning up on his plugged-in landline, phoning up people who lived out the area so they could look on the internet to find information, because there's no internet, no mobile signal, you know, nothing. So anyway, so that's our experience in Lancaster, and let's get back to... Yeah, so now I'm just going to talk a little bit about a very different experience of extreme weather, and that was the heat wave in Paris in 2003, because Alice Leroy, this woman here, you can see her credentials, she came to talk in Lancaster last year, so I'm nicking her stuff, using her stuff to tell you about it, but I think it's really instructive comparison in a way. So her presentation very much sort of told it how it unfolded, you know, rather than looking things back in retrospect. So 4th of August, it was over 30 degrees, but everybody said it was good weather, children playing and in the fountains and things. But the next 7 days was the hottest week in France since the 16th century, and importantly it was hot at night. And that last bit about the number of excess deaths, that's a sort of retrospective thing. They realised that even on the 4th of August, there were 300 excess deaths, 300 deaths more than you would expect at that time of year. So a week later, it's become known as Black Monday, and there was a doctor that appeared on the television saying that alarming numbers of people were being admitted to hospital with heat stroke, dehydration, etc. And the deputy mayor, so Alice worked for the deputy mayor, and he thought there was a real problem. This is before it became really, you know, sort of apparent. He thought there was a real problem because the funeral services couldn't cope with the number of people who had to be buried. I think they had to turn all sorts of, you know, like warehouses on the outskirts of Paris into mortuaries because they just couldn't cope with the figures. And that was really before it became sort of into public consciousness that there was actually some terrible tragedy going on. So, and then this is the figures for the whole period, 7th to 13th of August. 15,000 people died from heat in France. But importantly, overwhelmingly, those who died were elderly people living alone. And I think particularly in Paris, there's this sort of story about, you know, the family goes on holiday, leaving their elderly relative to die in their hot flat, you know, and so there was that sort of sense that, you know, France had people had sort of betrayed the sort of the trust of the elderly. And the president returned from holiday on the 30th, and he notoriously called for more solidarity, so people saw that as blaming the people rather than taking responsibility. And there was a lot of blame going on, basically. I think, interestingly, with the flood, something like that, it's a very visual catastrophe, and it sort of brings people together because they can all see what the problem is, whereas heat waves are sort of more invisible, and it's sort of less apparent what's happening. So this is a couple of quotes from Eric Kleinenberg, who's an American sociologist who did a study of the heat wave in Chicago that happened in 1995. And he came up with this quote, that heat waves are silent and invisible killers of silenced and invisible people. Because of the sort of people they kill the people who are isolated on their own. So finally, just some little lessons, how to cope, because I think it is a matter of coping. That's probably the best we're going to be able to do. So planning and preparation, yes, that's great, it all helps. But our third one there, you never know what's going to happen, and it's important that people take initiatives, deal with the situations that they find, and that they don't just, I'm not saying don't just follow the plan, but don't just follow the sort of pre-established rules that aren't really geared to the emergency situation you find yourself in. There's a story in Lancaster about some guys going and breaking down the door to the ambulance station because the ambulance station door couldn't be opened because it was controlled by electricity. So you have to take things into your own hands sometimes. And so our lesson from Lancaster is don't rely on electricity. There's now been lots of emergency planning in Lancaster, and one thing is that you need your emergency plan printed out on a hard copy, not just on a computer. And finally, live in a good community. So building up the community in the good times is really important, and having community facilities and community organisations and people that are used to working together, because it's the people around you who you might end up relying on. Okay.
And I suggest you take your own questions.
Yeah, fine. Okay.
5 minutes for questions for
Sorry, yeah, over there, yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I've been kind of waiting to hear something like this for quite a while, so I'm really grateful. It's really good to hear from people who've actually been, because you can't imagine some of this until you've been in that experience. No. So thank you, it's really valuable. What sense do you have about national policy and adaptation? Because I work in climate change, and it's been a long rant of mine that adaptation is this poor relation. We spend a lot of time talking and thinking about mitigation, but adaptation is still a long way behind the lag. Did you have a sense at the time that national policy was kind of coming in and helping out? And do you have a sense since that, things have been trying to learn these lessons?
No. I have to admit to not following national policy on adaptation, because, there's a limit to what you can do. But just to say that in Lancaster, for example, they're now talking about building, because all these businesses here, they now can't get flood insurance. And there's a cycle path along there. They're talking about building, between the river and the businesses, there's a cycle, old railway lines, there's a cycle path. They're talking about building a flood wall next to the cycle path. And they can't, it's not fully funded because the way they work out the funding, the Environment Agency for the flood wall, is all to do with protection of residential areas. They end up getting, they come up better on the cost-benefit analysis, however that's done, than the businesses. So that's a bit of an issue for us. But I don't know, the other view is, well, all these businesses should just move, but where they're going to go, and they're important employers in Lancaster and some quite long-standing companies. I haven't. I'm not answering the question really.
No, I think. There is a massive problem.
I know that I read something about the city council said that they were expected to give out. I think it was about giving out grants in the aftermath. And then, after that, they were expected to account for them in a way that was very difficult because, they get told to do one thing and then they get quizzed about what they've done. So I think they found dealing with the central government very difficult and not very sympathetic.
Just to chip in from a greenhouse point of view, it's something that we are interested in. As part of the Facing Up to Climate Reality project, we've coined this concept of transformational adaptation. But what we're saying is there needs to be a massive new effort in adaptation, but it needs to be envisaged not in a purely sort of defensive way of like building walls, but how do you adapt in ways which are compatible at the same time with mitigating and transforming our societies in the way that we need to. So that's part of the project that we're trying to do.
Sorry, there's that lady first, yeah.
Just a very simple question. Do you know if the Lancaster plans that have now been developed have been shared in other parts of the country?
Well, it'll be available on the website. I don't know. What do you mean by the Lancaster plan?
Well, I thought you said that Lancaster has now developed some kind of a plan on the basis of...
Oh, no, we've got emergency planning.
Yes, yes.
No, yeah, so we've got an emergency planning officer in the City Council who has been very busy since has had lots of interest from, particularly parishes and that sort of stuff, and setting up emergency centres and that sort of thing. So he has probably a handbook that then local groups sort of adapt. I could send it to you if you like. If you send me an email, send it to the info@greenhouse address, and I can send you the because I think I've got a copy somewhere of the basic thing.
Thank you very much.
Sorry,
Yes, at the City Council on Tuesday, I put forward a motion for an adaptation strategy for Norwich, climate change strategy, in the light of the summer heat wave. And I did a lot of research beforehand to find out what was being done at county level, at City Council level, and there is no such strategy. There are lots of policy gaps, for example, on adapting buildings, overheating the city generally, and need for more shading. And the City Council, even though it had researched the sort of same background to find out that the same things were going on as me, they couldn't accept that there wasn't such a strategy, so they said that there was work going on. There clearly isn't work going on. And again, it's a problem of a council being very defensive and not accepting actually that there is a need for such a strategy and for preparation. And so again, as residents, if you are able to contact your councillors and say that there is a need for an adaptation strategy, obviously that will put pressure on the council to accept the need to prepare one.
I mean, I think the other thing about the heat waves, we'll think from Paris and from the Chicago study, it's about people who are being on their own. Actually, in Paris, fewer people died. The very ill who were in care homes survived better than the people who were on their own at home. So it's about how do you find out who those people are, contact them at the right time so that they can ensure that they're doing the things they need to keep cool. It's about setting up those systems, as well as making our buildings so that they don't overheat. Sorry, yes, another question back there. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was listening to it. I guess my question was more, although it's emergency planning, with the predicted flooding and predicted more extreme weather conditions and stuff, it's not just going to become emergencies, it's going to become commonplace. And I guess I'm thinking from the perspective of a 24-year-old person who the predictions of sea rise by 50-50 when I'll be in my 50s is so extreme that 60% of Norwich will be underwater from the predictions of the current if it carries on as steadily as it is, not mitigating any extreme or sudden changes. And I guess I'm just interested in perhaps what is being done about adaptation and transformation, and that's not really a question, but that's just a worry that I have.
I don't think I can answer that.
That's okay, that's all right.
I can say something about that locally.
Do you want to say something about it?
There's quite a bit being done on mitigating flood risk because the government is providing money to do that, and so there's quite a well-developed plan. But it's very slow and it doesn't go far enough. For example, there was a £10 million plan in North Norwich to upgrade the highways infrastructure in case of, because there was a surface water flooding there. But Norwich has got several critical drainage areas, unbelievably, because although it hasn't got huge rivers, one problem about Norwich is it's got a huge amount of hard surfacing because so much of the city has been developed. And in the ward that I look after, a Victorian ward, it's also a critical drainage area because so much of the area has been built over, including all the gardens, back gardens, the front gardens, every scrap of land. And so hence that's a critical drainage area. And there are people living below ground level in basement flats. But until something happens, until there's a big flood problem there, they haven't had one street flooded, then the councils are not going to do anything, including Anglian Water, because they tend to react rather than prepare and advance, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah, certainly our council is now much more, strict on it in terms of what it lets be built and flood risk assessments and that sort of thing. So I do think the traditional way of looking at flood risk is to look at fluvial or coastal flooding, which is flooding from the rivers overtopping their banks. But we've actually seen quite a lot of flooding which is more surface water runoff. And they're now developing these flood maps, which are about where the water will go when, just when it's really heavy rain and it runs off a field and then down a road and then through somebody's kitchen, I mean, there were people in Kendal, for example, there were loads of people who got flooded who never expected to get flooded because the water just came off the fells through their house. And, it's just, there was just so much water.
Last question.
Jonathan.
I just wanted to compare to, we had some flooding in Surrey recently. It was over Christmas, New Year time. And the area I represent, the Environment Agency, have just done a study just like that. Yeah. And for the first time, they've overlaid fluvial and pluvial flash flooding and river flooding onto the same flood map. But they can only allocate money for where that's going to affect residential property. But the residential properties that are worst affected was a park home estate, which don't exist because they're not permanent houses. So I spent most of one weekend in early January 2 years ago taking up someone's floorboard so he could continue to live in his place. I was going to ask a slightly different question, which was about, imagine this is to the extent to which Brian presented this morning in terms of facing up to climate reality. My imagination of the flooding would be something I saw from living in Bangladesh. Big areas flooded, lots of people having to move. So what if resilience and adaptation of the place isn't enough? And what if we have to accept mass migration and retreat and relocation as part of the consequences of climate change? How should that fit into our emergency planning?
Yeah, I don't know. Just add what. Sorry, I'll let you have a say. Yeah. Though we're supposed to stop.
I advise a charity in Ethiopia, and if for those who are interested on a global scale, and it links into this, it's actually worth seeing a film that was made in around 2012 where 512 people died in floods. It was a very similar actually story to what's has been presented this afternoon. And 512 people died in floods there, and the charity I'm involved with decided to actually take action. So it's community delivered action. And the reason why that community was able to respond was because actually they knew each other and they worked within the community. And what they decided to do was really take the energy out of water. And when you actually look at climate change, and we've had some brilliant talks today, of which some of them have been on cattle and where you should have cattle and where you shouldn't, but actually some of the problems actually relate to inappropriate or kind of especially related to climate change, where you've got cattle or too many cattle on the hillside and the water's coming flooding down. So again, it is about appropriate action right the way through the landscape system, but equally making sure that the community take appropriate action. And in Ethiopia, they decided that they would actually do a few things. One is that they would actually create revetments, that they would actually do some replanting, they would allow for natural regen, that they would work together, and also that they would put together an early phone call system so that they could actually, they knew further up the valleys the water was coming so that they could actually take action. The same flood happened 12 years later and only one drunk person died, so they'd actually taken actions that, and they also used that water for irrigation in the hot periods as well. So they brought community benefits to a problem, a big issue that was actually killing hundreds of people.
It's
Yeah,
worth seeing.
yeah. I mean, just on flooding, I think the interesting thing is that the focus is often on these, you know, these sort of pictures, you know, on the people that have got flooded. But actually far more people get affected. I mean, not, you know, of course the impact isn't the same scale, but far more people get affected by the knock-on effects. So the power cut in Lancaster affected, you know, 60,000 people or something. In Cumbria, the Storm Desmond washed away the road between Grasmere and Keswick, which turned a half-hour journey into a 2-hour round trip, and or 2-hour journey. You know, anyway, it was just made it. And so, you know, you got kids that went to school in Keswick who were having to stay overnight because they couldn't travel on a daily basis anymore. So that sort of thing had a big effect on the community in the Lake District, and it's a secondary effect of the flooding. I mean, there was another picture that I saw about, I think there was one of the bridges that got affected by the floods at that point. You know, that bridge also carried the gas main and it was a telecommunications cable for an airport. So the flooding, that bridge going down could have affected this airport that was just, you know, miles away. Like, that it's all about those sort of, the systems are so interlinked that, you know, the breakdown of the system causes, which flooding can do because it knocks out critical infrastructure. That's what has the big effect on lots of people in our country, because fortunately we're not in a situation where flooding causes tens of people to lose their lives.
A vibrant discussion.
Yet.
Thank you, Anne.